The third question is, and it's more of a statement, you mentioned several best practices in your book. Describe one best practice in reference to poverty that would enhance the practice of aspiring principals, and why did you select this practice? First of all, I need to challenge the term best practices. I don't really know who decides on best practices, and I found that most best practices aren't realistic when it comes to the questions that we're dealing with now, diversity. There are best practices for teaching, there are best practices for learning, there are best practices for carrying on a conversation, but sometimes you have to alter those best practices or look for alternative ways of doing instead of just saying, I'm using best practices, without really knowing whether they're effective. Much the same as when teachers say, I taught it. Well, my question is, but did they learn it? So let's eliminate the word best practice, and let me speak to some things in the book that I think are good things to do when you're dealing with and educating. Take back that word dealing with. I don't feel we deal with children of poverty when we're trying to educate children of poverty. If you look on page 62, the one bold heading that I want you to pay attention to, among other things, is meeting the challenges presented by low SES neighborhoods. These are the challenges that will affect the success of every child in your building that's Title I or living below the poverty line. And the one best practice I would tell you to do, practice learning what these challenges are. I interviewed many teachers who had absolutely no internships in poverty, no real classes on poverty, so bravo Lamar University for subjecting you to getting some understanding on poverty, because most of the higher universities that we have now, you get Psych 101 and you learn about poverty in about 2 days and that's it. You have no internships in low economic schools, and where you learn is on the job, and it can take you way too long to figure out how to have respectful, honest conversations with parents of poverty, how to identify children's hurdles in poverty, and you waste a lot of time doing that. So that would be the best practice, loosely, that I would encourage you to pay attention to in this book, and it starts on page 62. You know, I speak of things about overcoming time and transportation needs, overcoming the lack of educational resources. You know, I had a librarian who, up until, I don't know, 2 years ago, kept telling me she wasn't going to let, she didn't think we should let report cards go home because we had so many kids not bring back a book. They're just not bringing back the books. And finally I just said to her, just write up the bill. Just write up the bill at the end of the year, give me the bill, and I'll use Title I funds to pay for it. Because you know what? One of two things have happened. They've either lost a book in a home, in transit, you know, from grandma's house to mom's house or dad's house, or homelessness, who knows, or they want the book and they don't want to bring it back. So if a child's not going to bring a book back because they so desperately need it, I'll pay for it. What's the difference? Okay, that's a different kind of best practice. Okay, best practice was before, if a kid didn't bring a book back, he didn't get to check out another one. Well, that's a lousy practice if you ask me. I don't encourage them to take every library book out and keep it at home. But if they run into one book, like I had my Nancy Drew books, that is so near and dear to their heart that they just can't bear to let it go, let it go. Let them keep it at home. You know, developing effective lines of communication. This is not a PTA newsletter. This is not a little cutesy little newsletter kindergarten thing with little hearts and flowers and kids, you know, and sunshine and birds and all that stuff. This is a really in-depth effort to communicate with parents. Don't always assume because they don't come in for parent-teacher conferences that they don't care about their kids. That may be the case in some, but when you start work at 6:30 in the morning, like I did when I was raising 3 kids, and get home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then try to keep up with Little League or Girl Scouts or anything that you can afford to do, and maybe you can't afford to do, maybe just get dinner on the table, get them all bathed and get them to bed, it doesn't leave a whole lot of time. And if back then I'd have taken time off to go to a parent-teacher conference, guess what? I'd have lost a whole day's pay. And I had 3 kids to feed, so that didn't always happen. It never happened if I had to lose pay. So those are another kind of things we have to think about. Pick up the phone. Say, you know, Mrs. Alvarez, Jose did a great job today, but I need him to come to school with his writing folder all the time. And if you can't figure out how to do that, if they don't speak English, go find a parent liaison. Go find a translator. Find somebody. And as principals newly coming into the field, make sure you have people on your staff that can speak more than one language. When I first came to my school, there was one person that spoke Spanish. Now I have at least 6 or 7, so that when I have those emergencies and I have those needs and teachers need that help, I make sure they have it. So those would be, you know, communication, transportation, understanding the barriers of economics, you know, dealing with people effectively with language. You don't have to speak Spanish, you don't have to speak the different languages, but you have to let them know that you're at least willing to understand and try. The best thing that I did as a principal, when I wrote out an address to my Hispanic parents and I had one of my translators translate it, I gave it in Spanish. Did I slaughter Spanish? Oh, you betcha. My Spanish parents had a ball giggling in the audience when I slaughtered all the words. But you know what? They knew that I gave it that old college try and that I was trying to reach them, much the same as I encourage them to reach me in English when they come in. So the best practice would be re-examine your best practices. That's the advice I'd like to give you. Take a look at the barriers starting on page 62 and how do you realign those practices to meet the needs of your kids.